It began as an ordinary day in the lecture hall, the kind where rows of tired students leaned back in their chairs, notebooks half filled, and the hum of a projector filled the silence. Nobody expected anything unusual. Nobody thought their routine lecture would turn into a memory that would live with them forever. But sometimes, life has a way of breaking through the ordinary and placing something unforgettable right in front of you. And that day it came in the form of predator cubs. A hush fell over the hall the moment the instructor stepped in, not with slides or textbooks, but with a small cage carried carefully in his hands. You could almost feel the air tighten, curiosity prickling through the students. Everyone sat up straighter. Something was different. Something wild was about to happen. And as the cage door opened, a ripple of shock rushed through the room. Out tumbled tiny predator cubs, creatures that should have belonged to the wild, not to a polished lecture hall. At first, fear pulsed through the room. Students froze, some leaning back, others holding their breath. The cubs, with their sharp eyes and padded paws, looked around curiously, their little claws clicking softly against the tiled floor. The instructor said nothing. He only watched, calm, as if this was exactly what he wanted everyone to see. The cubs sniffed the air, their movements both playful and powerful. One might have expected chaos, panic, or even danger. But what happened next silenced every heart in the room with wonder. Instead of snarling or scratching, the cubs trotted forward with an innocent curiosity, searching not for prey but for warmth. They paused at the feet of the students, tilting their heads, their small tails flicking. And then one of them, braver than the rest, climbed straight into a young woman's lap. Gasps echoed across the hall. The girl's hands trembled, hovering in the air as though unsure whether to touch the creature or stay completely still. But the cub had already decided. It curled up against her, eyes heavy, as if her lap was the safest place it could ever be. The tension in the hall melted into something softer, something human. Another cub climbed into a boy's lap in the back row, pressing its tiny body against his chest, nuzzling as though it had found its mother. Fear shifted into awe. And awe turned into a silence so deep, you could hear the gentle purrs of the cubs echoing against the walls. That was the moment everyone realized, these weren't predators today. They were simply children of the wild, seeking comfort, seeking connection. The instructor finally spoke, his voice low and steady, almost reverent. "We fear what we do not understand," he said, letting his words drift slowly through the room. "But sometimes what we fear most is simply waiting to be loved." The students sat frozen, caught between disbelief and wonder. The cubs weren't dangerous, not here, not in their innocence. They were fragile, yearning for warmth, their wildness softened by trust. And in that moment, the walls of the lecture hall dissolved. It wasn't just a classroom anymore. It was a place where human and animal met, where fear surrendered to tenderness. One of the cubs lifted its tiny head, locking eyes with the girl who held it. For a heartbeat, it was as though the whole world had narrowed into that single gaze. Her lips curved into a trembling smile, and she gently stroked its fur, whispering something only it could hear. That touch, gentle, hesitant, yet full of courage, spoke louder than any lecture could. And it changed everyone in the room. You could see it in their faces. The students who had arrived with blank stares now sat wide-eyed, their hearts racing not with fear but with wonder. They weren't just learning about nature. They were feeling it. They were touching it. They were part of it. And then came a moment no one expected. One cub climbed down, padding toward a boy who had been the most afraid, the one who had pulled his chair back the farthest. The cub stopped at his shoes, staring up at him with eyes that seemed almost knowing. The boy hesitated, his breath shallow, his hands trembling at the edge of the desk. But slowly, almost painfully, he reached down. The cub leaned forward, brushing against his hand with the softness of trust. A collective breath swept through the hall. Fear had been replaced. Connection had taken its place. And everyone felt it. The instructor walked to the front, his hands folded behind his back. "Predators," he said softly, "are not born with hate in their hearts. They are born with hunger, with instinct. But trust is something they can learn. And so can we." His words lingered like the echo of truth. The cubs shifted, climbing higher into their chosen laps, their tiny bodies heavy with the innocence of sleep. The lecture had become something far greater than a lesson. It had become an experience, a memory etched into their souls. And as the hall sat wrapped in silence, nobody wanted it to end. When the time finally came, the instructor gathered the cubs gently, one by one. The students let them go reluctantly, fingers trailing against their soft fur, as though afraid to lose the fragile magic that had filled the room. The cubs mewed softly as they were placed back in the cage, their eyes heavy with trust. The room felt changed, almost sacred, as though everyone had shared something too rare, too delicate to ever forget. The instructor paused before closing the cage. "Remember this," he said quietly, his eyes sweeping across the faces of his students. "Strength without compassion is nothing. And fear without understanding is a cage we build around ourselves. What you felt here today, don't let it go." His words fell like stones into water, rippling through every heart. The cubs looked out through the bars, unafraid, their innocence shining like a mirror held up to the human soul. And as the cage door shut, the silence that followed was not heavy. It was full. Full of connection. Full of hope. Full of a lesson that no textbook could ever teach. And that was how an ordinary lecture hall became unforgettable. How predator cubs entered a room filled with fear, and left it filled with love. And even years later, every student who sat in that hall would remember the warmth of tiny paws, the sound of tiny breaths, and the truth that sometimes, the wildest things in this world are the ones that teach us how to be human.